In the stillness of a northern winter night, when the forests fall silent and the lakes freeze into glass, it is easy to imagine Canada as a place that was always vast and always connected. But for much of its early history, that unity was only an idea, a fragile one, because without a single line tying east to west, the country might never have survived at all. Before the rails, distance itself was a barrier few could overcome. Mountains rose like walls, rivers froze, then thawed, then shifted their paths without warning. Entire regions remained cut off for months at a time, and quietly, inside government chambers lit by oil lamps, one question returned again and again. Could a nation this large truly hold together, or would it slowly drift apart? By the time the young Dominion of Canada was formed in 1867, that question had become urgent. To the south, the United States was expanding westward with speed and confidence. To the west, British Columbia stood isolated from the rest of the country, separated by thousands of kilometers of wilderness and mountain. Its leaders made a simple, decisive demand. They would only join Confederation if a railway could connect them to the east, one continuous line of steel, ocean to ocean. It was a promise that would define a nation, and it would become one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects ever attempted on Earth. The railway would be called the Canadian Pacific Railway, but building it would require more than vision. It would demand money, politics, and power. It would demand thousands of workers willing to cut through rock, forest, and frozen earth. And in the most dangerous sections, men would hang from ropes over sheer cliffs, lowering dynamite into the mountainside by hand. Many of them would never return home, because the story of this railway is not only about steel and locomotives. It is about the people who dreamed it into existence, the men who financed it, the politicians who nearly destroyed it, and the laborers, many of them immigrants, many of them treated as expendable, who gave their strength and often their lives to make it real. And for a time, it very nearly failed. In the years ahead, the project would be shaken by scandal, debt, impossible geography, and political collapse. At several moments, it came within reach of being abandoned entirely. But the idea of a railway stretching across Canada refused to disappear, because without it, the country itself might not endure. And so, as the first surveyors stepped into the vast interior, quietly, almost experimentally, in the years after Confederation, they began a journey that would reshape a continent, a journey measured not only in miles of track, but in sacrifice. And as those early routes were mapped across forests, rivers, and mountains, no one yet knew how dangerous the work would become, or how much it would cost. From those first quiet surveys, the work pressed forward. By the early 1870s, teams moved steadily into the interior, carrying instruments, notebooks, and provisions across landscapes that seemed to resist measurement itself. They followed river valleys through dense forest, traced routes along the edges of lakes, and searched for mountain passes that might allow a train to cross the great western ranges. Each report that returned to Ottawa carried the same message. It could be done, but the cost would be immense. Still, the pressure did not ease. In 1871, when British Columbia joined Confederation, the promise of a railway became a binding condition. Construction had to begin within 2 years, and the entire line was to be completed within 10. The responsibility for keeping that promise fell to John A. Macdonald, whose vision for Canada depended on it. He believed that a railway was more than transportation. It was a thread that could hold together a vast and fragile nation. But even the strongest vision can be shaken by politics. The scandal that had shaken the young country did not begin with a single moment. It unfolded gradually in the early 1870s as the search for investors intensified and the future of the railway hung uncertainly in the balance. The government needed private capital. The project was too vast, too expensive, and too risky to be built by public funds alone. Whoever agreed to finance the railway would require guarantees, subsidies, and political backing, and that meant influence. At the center of the negotiations stood a powerful Montreal businessman, Hugh Allen, who assembled a consortium prepared to take on the project. But Allen's group was not the only one interested. A competing faction with strong American financial connections also sought the contract. That possibility raised deep concerns within the government. If the railway, the very line meant to secure Canada's independence, fell under American control, its purpose could be quietly undermined. And so, as the decision approached, politics and business began to intertwine. In 1872, Canada entered a federal election. Macdonald's conservative government required funding for its campaign. At the same time, Allen's consortium needed political approval to secure the railway charter. In a series of letters and telegrams exchanged behind closed doors, the two interests drew closer together. Allen provided substantial financial contributions to the Conservative campaign. In return, his group expected to receive the railway contract. At the time, such arrangements existed in a gray space, common enough in the political culture of the 19th century, yet rarely exposed to public view. But this time, the correspondence would not remain hidden. By 1873, telegrams and documents began to surface. They revealed what appeared to be a direct connection between Allen's donations and the awarding of the railway contract. One message, attributed to Macdonald, seemed to request additional campaign funds from Allen, even as the contract decision remained pending. When these communications became public, they triggered a wave of outrage. Newspapers across the country seized the story. Political opponents demanded accountability. Citizens, in a young nation still defining its political standards, watched closely as the controversy unfolded. It became known as the Pacific Scandal. A parliamentary inquiry was launched. Witnesses were called. Letters were read aloud. And with each new detail, it became harder for the government to defend the integrity of its actions. Macdonald did not deny receiving funds. Instead, he argued that the railway was essential to Canada's survival, and that securing it required practical decisions in a competitive political environment. But for many, the issue was no longer the railway itself. It was the use of political power to shape its future. The pressure grew. By November 1873, Macdonald's government had lost the confidence of Parliament. It fell from power, and with it, the railway project was thrown into uncertainty. The contract with Allen's consortium was cancelled, plans were suspended, and for a time, the vision of a transcontinental line, so recently presented as inevitable, seemed close to being abandoned altogether. Yet even in the aftermath of scandal, the underlying need remained. British Columbia was still part of Confederation, bound by the promise of a railway connection. The Western Territories still required settlement and transport, and leaders across the political spectrum understood that Canada's unity depended on linking its regions together. In the years that followed, the government reconsidered its approach. Rather than awarding the project to a single politically connected group, it would restructure the entire plan. New financial arrangements would be created, greater oversight would be applied, and the railway would remain a national priority, even as the method of building it changed. By the time MacDonald returned to power in 1878, the lessons of the scandal had reshaped the political landscape. The new vision for the railway, what would soon become the Canadian Pacific Railway, would still rely on private investment, but it would proceed under stricter conditions and with broader public scrutiny. In that sense, the Pacific scandal left a lasting mark. It delayed the railway. It changed how it would be financed. And it left behind a cautionary memory, a reminder that even projects meant to unite a nation could be weakened by the misuse of power. Yet the railway itself would go on to be built. And as the years passed, the echoes of that early controversy would gradually fade, overshadowed by the immense physical effort of construction and the human stories that unfolded along the line. Because once the new company was formed in 1881, the focus shifted again, from politics to labor, from contracts to construction, and from debate to the physical act of carving a path across a continent. At its center stood a group of influential financiers and entrepreneurs. Among them were George Stephen, a banker with a keen sense for opportunity, and Donald A. Smith, whose political and business networks would prove essential in keeping the project alive through its most difficult years. They were granted extraordinary incentives, millions of acres of land along the route, financial subsidies, and exclusive operating rights that would shape Canada's economic landscape for generations. In return, they accepted a task that few believed could be completed on time. Construction began in earnest almost immediately. From the east, crews laid track westward from the settled regions of Ontario. From the west, teams advanced inland from the Pacific coast. Supply depots sprang up along the route. Temporary camps became small communities filled with workers, engineers, cooks, and teamsters moving equipment across terrain that often lacked even basic roads. Every mile required coordination. Timber for ties had to be cut and shaped. Steel rails had to be transported over vast distances. Bridges had to be built across rivers that flooded unpredictably. In some areas, track could be laid quickly across flat prairie. In others, a single kilometer might take weeks. But it was in the mountains that the work became most perilous. The chosen route through Kicking Horse Pass allowed the line to cross the Rocky Mountains, but the grades were steep, so steep that trains would later struggle to climb them safely. During construction, workers clung to ledges and carved narrow shelves into the rock. Explosives were used to blast through cliffs, sending debris tumbling into valleys below. To carry out this work, the railway company relied heavily on Chinese laborers. Beginning in the early 1880s, thousands of Chinese men were recruited, some already in Canada, others brought from across the Pacific. They were often assigned the most dangerous tasks: handling explosives, clearing rock falls, and working in areas prone to avalanches. Their wages were significantly lower than those of white workers, They paid for their own food, their own equipment, and often their own medical care. Camps were segregated. Living conditions were harsh. And when accidents occurred, there was little protection. Men were buried by landslides, swept away by sudden floods, or injured by premature explosions. Many who died were buried near the tracks they helped build, their graves unmarked or soon forgotten. Yet their labor continued day after day, season after season, pushing the line forward through some of the most difficult terrain on the continent. As the years passed, the urgency increased. The company faced mounting financial pressure. The cost of construction climbed higher than expected. There were moments when it seemed that the railway might run out of money before it reached the mountain's far side. At one critical point in 1884, the company's finances were so strained that work slowed almost to a halt. Without additional government support, the entire project might have been abandoned. Once again, the future of the railway, and perhaps the unity of the country, hung in the balance. But the support came. With new loans and renewed determination, construction resumed at full pace. Crews pushed through the final, most difficult stretches in British Columbia, laying track along river canyons and across unstable slopes where rockslides were a constant threat. Then, in November 1885, at a place called Craigellachie, the eastern and western sections of track finally met. On that day, Donald A. Smith stepped forward to drive the final spike into the rail. It was a simple act, performed with a hammer and a single spike of iron. But it marked the completion of a line that stretched from the Atlantic provinces toward the Pacific coast, linking regions that had once been separated by months of travel into a journey that could now be made in days. The first transcontinental railway in Canada was complete. Yet completion did not mean stability. In the months and years that followed, the company faced new challenges. Maintaining the line through harsh winters required constant effort. Snowdrifts buried tracks. Avalanches destroyed sections of rail. Bridges needed reinforcement. And the steep grades in the Rockies created safety risks for trains descending long mountain slopes. Still, trains began to run. Passengers boarded in eastern cities and traveled westward across the country. Settlers followed the railway into the prairies, establishing farms and towns along its path. Goods moved more quickly than ever before. Grain, timber, minerals, feeding a growing national economy. The railway began to shape Canada's development in visible and lasting ways. But beneath that growth lay another story, one of displacement and change for Indigenous communities whose lands the railway crossed. Treaties, some negotiated under pressure, altered patterns of life that had existed for generations. The arrival of the railway brought settlers, industries, and new forms of governance into regions where Indigenous nations had long lived according to their own systems and traditions. The transformation was profound, and its effects would echo through the decades to come. As the 1890s approached, the Canadian Pacific Railway had become more than a line of track. It was a powerful corporation, a driver of settlement, and a symbol of national unity. Yet it also carried within it the memory of those who had built it under difficult and often unjust conditions. And as the company looked ahead to expansion, to new routes, and to new economic opportunities, it would continue to evolve, sometimes prospering, sometimes struggling, shaped by the changing needs of a growing country. Because the completion of the railway in 1885 was not the end of its story. It was only the beginning of a new era, one in which the steel line that crossed a continent would begin to transform the lives of millions, and in which the legacy of its creation would continue to unfold in ways no one at Craigelachie could yet foresee. As the 1890s settled in, the railway that had once been a promise became something far more complex, a living system that moved people, goods, and ideas across the length of a young country. Stations grew into towns. Towns became cities. Grain elevators rose beside the tracks on the prairies, and sawmills clustered along the line in forested regions. The Canadian Pacific Railway was no longer only a means of connection. It was an engine of settlement and economic change. And yet, even as it expanded, the railway faced its first major tests as a national lifeline. In the early 1890s, Canada entered a period of economic downturn. Global markets slowed. Immigration faltered. The optimism that had followed the completion of the railway gave way to uncertainty. Revenues dropped. Costs remained high. The company adapted. It diversified, expanding into shipping lines across the Atlantic and Pacific, establishing luxury hotels along its routes to encourage tourism, and promoting Western Canada as a destination for settlers from Europe and beyond. At the same time, it continued to extend its network, adding branch lines deeper into the interior, connecting remote communities to the main line, and reinforcing its role as a unifying structure across a vast landscape. By the turn of the 20th century, the railway had become one of the most powerful corporations in the country. Its influence reached into politics, commerce, and daily life. Trains carried mail, transported troops, delivered supplies to isolated communities, and allowed families to travel distances that had once seemed impossible. But beneath that expansion, the human cost of its creation remained present, sometimes quietly, sometimes in moments that demanded attention. Chinese laborers who had helped build the line were now facing new restrictions. In 1885, the same year the final spike was driven, the federal government introduced a head tax on Chinese immigrants entering Canada. The tax would increase in the years that followed, effectively limiting further immigration and placing heavy financial burdens on those already in the country. Many of the workers who had risked their lives building the railway were now denied the opportunity to bring their families to join them. Their contribution had helped connect the country, yet their place within it remained restricted. As the years moved into the early 1900s, the railway continued to evolve. New lines pushed north and south. Competing railways emerged, challenging the dominance of the Canadian Pacific and creating a more complex network of transportation across the country. The government itself began supporting additional transcontinental routes, leading to the creation of what would later become Canadian National Railways. Competition brought both opportunity and strain. Fares shifted. Freight rates fluctuated. Smaller communities sometimes found themselves bypassed by new routes, while others grew rapidly with increased access to transportation. Through it all, the Canadian Pacific Railway remained a central presence, its trains crossing the country in every season, its tracks threading through mountains, forests, and prairie. Then came the years of global conflict. With the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the railway took on a new role. It became a critical part of the war effort, transporting troops to ports, carrying supplies across the country, and moving resources needed for military production. Railway workers faced long hours under demanding conditions. Equipment wore down under constant use. The system that had once been built for settlement and commerce was now serving the needs of a nation at war. When the war ended in 1918, Canada entered a period of transition. The railway adapted once again, shifting from wartime logistics back to civilian life. Passenger travel increased during the 1920s. Tourism grew, encouraged by the company's hotels and scenic routes through the Rockies. But stability would not last. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought new hardship. Economic activity slowed dramatically. Freight volumes dropped. Many Canadians struggled to afford travel or ship goods. Railway revenues declined, and maintaining such a vast network became increasingly difficult. Workers faced layoffs, reduced hours, and uncertainty. And yet the trains continued to run. Even in times of economic hardship, the railway remained a necessary link between regions. It carried essential goods, food, fuel, materials, across distances that could not easily be bridged by other means. Then, in 1939, the world entered another war. During the Second World War, the Canadian Pacific Railway again became a vital component of national logistics. Troops moved across the country. Supplies flowed from factories to ports. Equipment traveled by rail to training bases and shipping points. The network operated under immense pressure, maintaining schedules despite increased demand and limited resources. When the war ended in 1945, the country entered a new era, one defined by technological change. Automobiles became more common. Highways expanded. Air travel began to offer faster connections between major cities. The railway, once the dominant form of long-distance transport, now faced new competition. In response, the Canadian Pacific Railway modernized. Diesel locomotives replaced steam engines. Infrastructure was upgraded. Freight services were refined to meet changing industrial needs. Passenger services were redesigned to remain competitive, offering comfort, efficiency, and scenic journeys that appealed to travelers. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the railway continued to adapt, even as the nature of transportation in Canada shifted. Passenger travel by rail gradually declined as cars and airplanes became more accessible. Freight, however, remained essential. The railway continued to carry bulk goods, grain, minerals, timber, linking producers with markets across the country and beyond. During these decades, broader social changes also shaped the railway's legacy. Recognition began to grow for the workers who had built the line under difficult conditions. Historians, communities, and descendants of laborers, particularly Chinese Canadians, began to bring forward stories that had long been overlooked. Memorials were established. Historical records were re-examined. The narrative of the railway expanded beyond engineering achievement to include the human experiences that made it possible. By the late 20th century, the Canadian Pacific Railway had become both a transportation company and a symbol of Canadian history. Its tracks representing not only connection, but also the layered stories of those who had lived and worked along them. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the company continued to evolve within a global economy. Freight operations became more specialized and efficient. International trade increased the movement of goods across borders. Intermodal transport, combining rail with trucking and shipping, became a central part of logistics. The railway that had once been built to unify a nation now functioned as part of a global network, and still, its original purpose remained visible. Trains continued to cross the same mountain passes, follow the same river valleys, and pass through the same communities that had grown up along the line more than a century earlier. In the years that followed, conversations about the railway's legacy continued. Discussions of reconciliation brought renewed attention to the impact of the railway on indigenous lands and communities. Recognition of Chinese laborers' contributions led to formal acknowledgments and apologies for past discrimination, including the historic head tax. These reflections did not change the past, but they reshaped how the story was told. Because the history of the Canadian Pacific Railway is not only a record of steel and timber, of locomotives and schedules. It is a record of decisions, political, economic, and human. It is a record of ambition and compromise, of vision and consequence. And it is a story that continues. Today, freight trains still move across Canada along routes first established in the 19th century. They carry containers filled with goods from across the world, linking ports, cities, and industries in a continuous flow. In some places, passenger trains still follow those same lines, offering travelers a glimpse of landscapes that once challenged the first surveyors and builders. The mountains remain. The rivers still change with the seasons. And the line that was once only an idea, a fragile thread imagined in the quiet rooms of a young government, still stretches across the country, binding its regions together. As the years continue to pass, the railway endures, not unchanged, but adapted, reshaped by time. A reminder that nations are not only defined by their borders or their governments, but by the paths they build between their people. And somewhere, in the distant rhythm of wheels on steel, the story continues, quietly, steadily, moving forward into the future.